In the grim darkness of the far future, where the lines between life and death blur and the price of knowledge is steep, one man's ambition will alter the fate of a world. On the desolate planet of Gallen's Reach, a brilliant scientist dares to defy the natural order, delving into forbidden realms of decay and transformation. As the light of hope wanes and the shadows of corruption loom ever larger, the galaxy trembles at the threshold of a harrowing new dawn. Amidst the decay of a dying world, ancient powers stir, and the whispers of dark gods grow louder. Can the remnants of humanity's defenders hold back the tide of ruin? Or will they too succumb to the relentless march of entropy? Prepare for an unforgettable journey through the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where the pursuit of knowledge may unleash horrors beyond imagining, and salvation comes at a cost far greater than life itself.
Alright, not a whole lot to say. This is the part 2 of a 3-part series. I hope you enjoy. More stuff on the way. Base Marine, Tyranid, Nurgle story coming up. I have a heist story coming up, and I have a creepy, I'm trying to make it creepy story, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, stay tuned. Please like, comment, subscribe. I'll talk to you after the story. Let me know what you think. Enjoy. And yeah, have fun. Talk to you after.
Morbus stood over the dissection table, his attention focused on the rot that had spread across his left arm. The skin, once pale and smooth, was now a patchwork of sores and festering wounds. His flesh sagged, bloated with fluid, and a sickly green hue had begun to creep up from his fingertips. But instead of horror, there was only fascination. He picked up a scalpel, holding it delicately between his fingers, and brought it to the edge of the saw. With a precise motion, he sliced through the inflamed skin, watching as a thick, foul-smelling pus oozed from the wound. Morbus inhaled deeply, his lips parting in a satisfied smile. The decay fascinated him, the way his body responded to Nurgle's influence, the way his flesh seemed to thrive in its rotting state.
This is not disease,
he muttered to himself as he probed the wound, his fingers slick with the foul liquid.
This is evolution.
He recorded his observations with a detached, scientific tone, as if examining a specimen under the microscope. His own body had become the subject of his research, and he reveled in the changes. His chest heaved as he coughed, a deep rattling sound that left a coppery taste in his mouth. A dark stain appeared on his glove as he wiped his lips, but even that did not faze him. It was all part of the transformation. The lab itself had undergone a similar change. The once bright lights flickered, struggling to penetrate the thick growth of mold that clung to the ceiling. The beeping of machines had become erratic, their signals corrupted by the moisture that dripped from the walls. Vials of once sterile samples had become overgrown with bacteria and fungi, their contents spilling over the sides in a grotesque display of life overtaken by decay. Morbus watched it all, unbothered by the filth that had consumed his sanctuary. It was all progress, his progress, and he was enthralled by every second of it. Feochtar and Grendel stood at their usual posts, their hulking frames silent and still. But even they were not immune to the transformation that had overtaken the lab. Their once pristine mechanical limbs had begun to corrode, the metal rusting and fusing with the decaying flesh that had been grafted onto their bodies. Tubes of biological matter, once meticulously maintained, had become clogged with a thick, dark substance that pulsed and throbbed as if alive. Morbus noticed the changes in his servitors, but like his own transformation, he saw it as a sign of progress. Feochtar, once a perfectly obedient machine, now twitched sporadically, his mechanical arm jerking unnaturally as if trying to escape the flesh that had grown over it. Grendel too had begun to show signs of change. His cybernetic eye flickered, the red glow dimming as his organic components struggled to keep pace with the decay spreading through his system. For the first time in months, Morbus heard a sound from his servitors that was not the mechanical whirring of gears or the hiss of hydraulics. It was a low, pitiful moan, a sound that was unmistakably human. Feochtar's head jerked slightly, his once lifeless eyes now flickering with something that resembled awareness. It was only for a moment, but in that brief instant, Morbus saw something. The remnants of the man Feochtar had once been, fighting desperately against the servitor conditioning that had stripped him of his humanity. But the moment passed, and Feochtar fell silent once more, his body returning to its mindless servitude. Grendel too had begun to exhibit signs of consciousness. His limbs trembled as the biological corruption fused with his mechanical frame, and in those moments of lucidity, Morbus could see the fear in his eyes. The servitors, once emotionless tools, were becoming aware of their fate. They were slowly, agonizingly turning into abominations, half machine, half decayed flesh, their minds torn between the cold obedience of a servitor and the horror of their organic mutations. Yet Morbus felt no sympathy for their suffering. To him, their condition was a fascinating byproduct of his experiments. The servitors were evolving just as he was. Their fear, their pain, it was nothing more than another step in the process of transformation. He watched them with clinical detachment as they twitched and moaned, their once efficient bodies now struggling under the weight of their mutations. To Morbus, it was all progress, and progress was all that mattered. Morbus's fascination with decay had only deepened. The rot that had overtaken his lab, his body and his servitors was no longer something to be feared or resisted. It was to be embraced, studied, and ultimately controlled. His transformation had begun, and with it came the realization that he was no longer bound by the limits of mortality. He was something more, something greater. And as the servitors twitched and groaned in the darkness, Morbus smiled. The air in the lab had grown thick, heavy with the stench of rot and decay. The walls, once bright and sterile, were now covered in a patchwork of mold and grime, their once smooth surfaces now cracked and oozing with biological growths. What had once been a place of scientific order had become a festering hive of mutation, and Morbus reveled in it. His once driven pursuit of healing had been replaced by something darker, something far more insidious. He no longer sought to conquer disease or prolong life. Those ambitions seemed trivial now. What Morbus pursued was the essence of decay itself, the beauty in its inevitable consumption of all things. To him, decay was not the end of life, but the true beginning, the purest form of existence. Where others saw death, Morbus saw transformation. Where others recoiled in horror, he found fascination. His own body had become a living testament to this truth. The sores that covered his skin had grown, their edges ragged and raw, leaking a putrid fluid that dripped from his swollen limbs. His flesh sagged in places bloated and pulsing with disease, but to Morbus, it was a gift. Each new wound, each fresh mark of rot, was a sign that he was drawing closer to understanding. Nurgle's whispers filled his mind now, guiding his every action, urging him to embrace the decay fully. And he did. In the center of his lab, grotesque creations writhed in containment tanks, their once living forms twisted beyond recognition. They were abominations of flesh and bone, their bodies slowly breaking down under the weight of disease. Some were small, pitiful things, creatures that had once been native to Decessus the Four, now reduced to pulsing masses of rot and mutation. Others were larger, humanoid figures that had once been subjects of Morbus's early experiments, their limbs distended and warped, their skin mottled with patches of decay. Tubes filled with thick, dark fluid connected them to machines that sputtered and flickered, barely functioning under the strain of the growing corruption. Morbus stood before one of the containment units, his eyes gleaming with anticipation as he watched the creature inside writhe. Its flesh bubbled and shifted, its bones cracking and reforming under the pressure of the mutations coursing through it. He leaned in closer, pressing his face against the glass, fascinated by the intricate patterns of rot that spread across the creature's skin. It was beautiful, in its own grotesque way.
This
He whispered to himself.
is the truth of life, not in the pristine, perfect form of youth, but in the decay that follows. This is the gift of Nurgle.
He smiled, his lips cracking as they stretched over his bloated, decaying face. His mind no longer clung to the concepts of morality or ethics. Those were irrelevant now. What mattered was the process, the slow, inevitable rot that consumed everything. His work was no longer about healing or saving. It was about embracing the decay, understanding its power, and ultimately mastering it. Morbus moved through his lab with a fevered intensity, his mind consumed by his new purpose. The creatures in the containment tanks had long since stopped responding to conventional treatments. Where once he had sought to heal them, now he accelerated their decomposition. His hands, swollen and clumsy, still managed to manipulate the controls with a precision born of obsession. He injected fluids into their veins, concoctions of disease and filth, watching with rapt attention as their bodies twisted further. One of the creatures, a malformed lump of tissue and bone, let out a pitiful groan as its skin split open, revealing a mass of writhing organs beneath. Morbus watched, utterly fascinated, as the creature's body began to break down before his eyes. Its limbs, already distended and warped, twisted at unnatural angles, the bones snapping audibly under the strain. Its skin sloughed off in wet, fleshy chunks, pooling on the floor of the containment unit in a viscous puddle. Morbus recorded every detail, his hands shaking with excitement as he captured the moment of its decay. This was no failure. This was evolution. To rot was to live, and in that decay, there was an undeniable beauty. In another tank, a larger creature, once human, let out a gurgling sound as its chest caved in, collapsing under the weight of the mutations that had taken hold. Its face, barely recognizable now, was a grotesque mask of sagging flesh and bulging eyes. It clawed weakly at the glass, its once human hands now twisted into malformed claws, its fingers covered in boils and sores that oozed with dark, putrid liquid. Morbus leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass as he watched. He could see the creature's life ebbing away, its body breaking down into a mess of organic sludge. And yet, in those final moments, there was something perfect, something pure.
Beautiful.
Morbus muttered, a smile playing at the corners of his cracked lips.
It's all so beautiful.
He turned away, satisfied with the results. There would be more experiments, more creatures to mutate, more decay to observe. The work was endless, and he reveled in every moment of it. His connection to Nurgle had grown stronger, the gods' whispers filling his mind with knowledge and purpose. There was no longer any doubt. Decay was the ultimate truth, and Morbus had embraced it fully. Feochtar and Grendel had not been spared the horrors of Morbus's new obsession. The once efficient servitors who had moved with mechanical precision through the lab were now grotesque shadows of their former selves. Their once pristine mechanical limbs had fused with decaying flesh, their servitor bodies now bloated and distended, covered in sores and boils that oozed with foul liquid. But it was not just their bodies that had changed. Their minds, once wiped clean by servitor conditioning, had begun to awaken. It was subtle at first, a flicker of awareness in their lifeless eyes, a twitch of hesitation in their mechanical movements. But as the corruption spread, those moments of clarity became more frequent, and with that awareness came horror. In one particularly harrowing moment, Feochtar's mechanical arm twitched violently as he attempted to complete a routine task. His head jerked unnaturally to the side, his eyes wide with terror as a guttural scream escaped his throat. It was a sound that should not have been possible, a cry of agony, of fear, of desperate, futile resistance against the corruption that had overtaken him. Morbus, standing nearby, watched with detached amusement. Feochtar's scream intensified as his body convulsed, the mechanical components fusing further with the rotting flesh, the lines between machine and organism blurring into a grotesque mass of pulsing, diseased tissue. For a brief moment, Feochtar's eyes met Morbus's, wide with a flicker of human recognition, an imploring, terrified gaze that seemed to beg for release. Morbus chuckled softly, turning back to his work. An amusing side effect, he mused, his voice tinged with cold amusement. Grendel, too, had begun to show signs of consciousness. His once unfeeling body now trembled with each step, his mechanical legs faltering as his bloated torso weighed him down. His face, a horrific mask of twisted flesh and rusted metal, contorted in a grotesque expression of pain as he let out a low, keening wail, a sound that echoed through the decaying lab. In their moments of lucidity, the servitors were aware of the horror that had befallen them. They knew they were trapped, their bodies and minds slowly unraveling under the weight of Nurgle's corruption. They screamed, they wept, they begged for release, but their voices were drowned out by the relentless advance of the decay. And Morbus, now fully under Nurgle's influence, found their suffering amusing. He watched them with the same clinical detachment that he reserved for his experiments, observing their pain as if it were just another step in the process of transformation. To him, their agony was a testament to the power of decay, a reminder that all things, even the mindless servitors, were subject to the will of Nurgle. Morbus smiled as the screams of Feochtar and Grendel filled the air, his mind fully consumed by the rot that had taken hold of his body and soul. He no longer saw them as servants or even as tools. They were simply part of the grand experiment, flesh and metal fused into a grotesque mockery of life, their suffering nothing more than an amusing side effect of progress. The lab was a dark, festering hive of decay, filled with the scent of rot and the sounds of malfunctioning machinery. Mold crept across the walls like a living thing, pulsating with each drop of moisture that trickled from the ceiling. In the center of the lab, the twisted forms of Feochtar and Grendel stood, their hulking bodies trembling under the weight of their mutations. The once efficient servitors had become grotesque parodies of life, half machine, half decayed flesh, their bodies now barely recognizable. Morbus stood nearby, observing with cold fascination. His own body had continued to deteriorate, the sores that covered his skin now festering, but to him the sight before him was far more captivating. Feochtar and Grendel had become his latest experiment, their forms slowly merging into a single monstrous entity under the weight of Nurgle's influence. Their suffering was palpable, their mechanical limbs twitching sporadically, their rotting flesh fusing to the cold metal in unnatural ways. But Morbus saw only progress. Their transformation had been inevitable. The corruption that had overtaken the lab had spread to them, just as it had to everything else, and Morbus had been more than willing to encourage it. He had begun deliberately experimenting on them weeks ago, pushing their mutations further with each new injection of Nurgle's vile blessings. Their bodies had responded in kind, twisting and bloating under the weight of the diseases that coursed through their veins. At first, the changes had been subtle, flesh fusing with metal in small, almost imperceptible ways. But as time went on, the mutations became more extreme. Feochtar's once gleaming mechanical arm had begun to warp, the metal bending and twisting, fusing with the decaying flesh of his shoulder. Grendel's cybernetic legs had grown misshapen, their joints now bloated and rotting, the metal grafting itself to the diseased tissue that surrounded it. Morbus watched with rapt attention as the two servitors began to merge. Their once distinct forms were now becoming one, a grotesque fusion of limbs and metal, their bodies fusing in ways that defied nature. The process was slow, agonizing, but to Morbus it was beautiful. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass of the containment unit as he observed the transformation. Feochtar's mechanical arm jerked violently, its movements no longer under his control. Grendel's body twitched in response, the flesh on his torso rippling as it began to meld with Feochtar's. The two servitors, once separate, were now becoming a single monstrous entity, a mass of bloated flesh, rusted metal, and exposed machinery. Their limbs twisted and contorted, their skin grafting itself to the cold steel in ways that made Morbus's heart race with excitement. For a brief moment, Feochtar's head jerked to the side, his eyes flickering with a flash of awareness. His mouth opened in a silent scream, his face twisted in a grotesque expression of terror. But the scream never came. The servitor conditioning held firm, and Feochtar's voice was reduced to a low, gurgling moan as his body continued to merge with Grendel's. Morbus recorded every detail, his fingers moving swiftly across the terminal as he chronicled the fusion. He had accelerated their mutation, injecting them with concoctions of disease and decay, watching with scientific detachment as their bodies warped and twisted. What had once been two separate beings were now merging, their flesh and metal fusing together, creating a single, horrific form. Their combined consciousness flickered between mindless servitor obedience and moments of horrifying self-awareness. In those moments, their eyes would widen, their mouths twisting into grotesque shapes as they tried to scream, but the mechanical components that dominated their bodies held them in check. Their brief cries of terror would dissolve into gurgles, the sound of their agony echoing through the decaying lab. Morbus observed it all with a detached sense of amusement. To him, the fusion of Feochtar and Grendel was a triumph, a perfect manifestation of his ability to manipulate life and death. This was not just mutation, it was evolution. This was not failure, this was success. He had taken two separate beings, two mindless machines, and fused them into something greater, something more complete. The abomination that had once been Feochtar and Grendel now stood before Morbus, its grotesque form trembling as it tried to remain upright. Its body was a hideous mass of fused limbs, its skin stretched taut over the exposed machinery that jutted out from its decaying flesh. Where once there had been two distinct servitors, now there was only one, a single monstrous entity that groaned and twitched with every labored breath. Morbus stood before the creature, his arms folded across his chest, a look of cold amusement on his face. To anyone else, the sight of the abomination would have been a nightmare, a horrific blend of metal and flesh, its body pulsing with rot and disease. But to Morbus it was a masterpiece. The creature let out a low, pitiful moan, its eyes flickering with brief moments of awareness. For a split second, Morbus saw the remnants of Feochtar's mind fighting against the servitor conditioning, a desperate attempt to break free of the horror that had overtaken him. But it was fleeting. The servitor programming reasserted itself, and the abomination fell silent once more, its limbs twitching uncontrollably. Morbus chuckled softly, shaking his head as he watched the creature struggle.
An amusing side effect,
he muttered to himself, his voice filled with cold indifference.
You've become something far more useful than you ever were.
The creature, now fully fused, let out a gurgling cry as its body jerked forward, its mechanical limbs scraping against the floor. Morbus stepped back, watching with mild curiosity as the abomination tried to move, its grotesque form barely able to support its own weight. The fusion had been a success, but there were still adjustments to be made. For now, though, Morbus was content. The Feochtar Grendel abomination, as he had come to think of it, was his most loyal creation, a testament to his mastery over life and death. Its moments of self-awareness, its brief flickers of terror, were nothing more than quirks, amusing anomalies in an otherwise perfect experiment. Morbus turned back to his work, ignoring the creature's gurgling cries as it struggled to find balance. It was nothing more than a tool, a pet to be used in his future experiments. The suffering it endured, the agony it experienced in those brief moments of awareness, was inconsequential.
Soon,
he whispered, more to himself than to the creature.
You will serve me in ways you can't yet comprehend.
The Feochtar Grendel abomination groaned in response, its fused consciousness flickering between servitude and horror, its mind trapped in a never-ending cycle of suffering. But to Morbus, it was nothing more than another step in the process of transformation, a grotesque reflection of his growing power over the decay that had consumed him. And he relished every moment of it. The lab had become a living, breathing thing, a festering pit of rot and decay. What had once been a place of sterile scientific exploration was now a shrine to Nurgle's corruption. Mold and fungi covered every surface, their spores thick in the air, while dark, viscous liquids oozed from cracks in the walls and floors, pooling around the equipment that had long since ceased to function. The entire place reeked of death and disease, and Morbus reveled in it. His own body was a grotesque reflection of his surroundings. He had once been a man, a biologist with lofty ambitions, but that man no longer existed. His flesh had bloated and sagged, his skin a patchwork of sores and festering wounds. His arms and legs had swollen to monstrous proportions, the flesh barely holding together as rot consumed him from the inside out. Yet Morbus did not feel pain. He felt ecstasy. Every new infection, every new wound, was a gift from Nurgle, a sign that he had been chosen for a higher purpose. The corruption had consumed him completely, both body and mind. There was no longer any trace of the scientist who had once sought to conquer disease and heal the sick. Now, Morbus sought only to spread the blessings of Nurgle, to bring rot and decay to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. His thoughts were no longer his own. Nurgle's whispers filled his mind, guiding him, urging him to embrace his role as a harbinger of pestilence. The Feoshtar Grendel abomination stood by his side, its grotesque form twitching with every breath it took. The servitors, once loyal assistants in his quest for scientific knowledge, had become something else entirely. Their bodies, a fusion of metal and decaying flesh, now moved with a grotesque, lumbering gait. Their faces, once blank and expressionless, now contorted with brief flashes of agony as they wrestled with their new existence. And yet, despite their suffering, they obeyed. The abomination that Feoshtar and Grendel had become was the perfect symbol of Morbus's victory over life and death, a twisted mockery of existence, bound to serve him in his new purpose. It was no longer about healing, no longer about science. Morbus had transcended those petty ambitions. Now his work was divine. Morbus stood before a rusted, cracked mirror, staring at the monstrosity he had become. His reflection was barely recognizable as human. His eyes, once sharp and focused, were now sunken into his bloated face. The whites turned a sickly yellow. His skin was mottled with rot, hanging loose in places, while other parts had fused with the diseased metal plates that covered his torso and limbs. Pustules and sores dotted his body, each one oozing a thick green fluid that dripped to the floor in slow, steady drops. He ran his hand over the largest of the sores, his fingers tracing the ragged edges of the wound. It didn't hurt. Nothing hurt anymore. Pain was an irrelevant sensation, something that belonged to his old self. Now all he felt was Nurgle's embrace, a constant, comforting presence that whispered to him in the quiet moments.
"This is the truth,"
Morbus muttered to himself, his voice raspy and wet.
"This is the perfection I have sought."
His body was no longer a vessel for scientific knowledge. It was a testament to decay. He had transcended the limits of mortality, his flesh now nothing more than a canvas for Nurgle's blessings. Every wound, every festering sore was proof of the god's divine touch. His transformation was nearly complete, and soon he would no longer be Morbus at all. He would be something greater, an avatar of Nurgle's will, a harbinger of rot and pestilence. Behind him the lab pulsed with life, its organic tendrils wrapping around the walls and floors like veins in a living organism. The vials of disease that lined the shelves had become twisted, their contents now teeming with new, horrific forms of life. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and Morbus breathed it in deeply, his lungs filling with the noxious fumes. He turned to the Feoshtar Grendel abomination, his bloated lips curling into a smile. The creature stood silently, its multiple eyes blinking in unison, its limbs twitching uncontrollably as the diseases that ravaged its body continued their work.
"This,"
Morbus said, gesturing to the creature,
"is only the beginning."
His mind was no longer focused on the confines of his lab. He had seen the future in Nurgle's visions, worlds consumed by decay, entire populations twisted and transformed by the plagues he would unleash. His work here was done, but his true purpose had only just begun. It was time to take Nurgle's gifts to the galaxy, to spread the blessings of rot and ruin to the stars. Morbus stood at the entrance to the lab, his body hunched and bloated, his mind fully consumed by thoughts of pestilence and decay. The Feoshtar Grendel abomination lumbered beside him, its grotesque form heaving with every breath, its fused consciousness barely able to comprehend the horror it had become.
This is our time.
Morbus rasped, his voice filled with a twisted sense of pride.
The galaxy will know the name Rotwarden.
No longer Morbus the scientist, he was now an avatar of Nurgle's will. His transformation was complete, and he had embraced his new role with fervor. The man he had once been, the biologist who had sought to cure disease, was gone. In his place stood the Rotwarden, a harbinger of pestilence and decay, destined to spread Nurgle's gifts across the galaxy. He turned to the Feochtar Grendel abomination, his smile widening as he watched the creature's grotesque form shift and twitch. Its suffering was irrelevant now. Its purpose, like his own, was clear. Together they would bring ruin to the stars, spreading disease and mutation wherever they went.
Come,
Morbus said, his voice filled with purpose.
we have much work to do.
With a heavy, lumbering gait, Morbus led the creature out of the lab, his mind filled with visions of the destruction they would bring. Outside, the world of Decessus IV lay in ruin, its once sickly fields now nothing more than a wasteland of rot and decay. The sky was choked with clouds of disease, and the air was thick with the buzzing of flies. It was a perfect reflection of Nurgle's blessings, and Morbus felt a swell of pride as he looked out over the devastation. But this world was only the beginning. Morbus, now the Rotwarden, had his sights set on the wider galaxy. He would gather his warband, the festering host, and together they would spread Nurgle's gifts to every corner of the Imperium. Entire planets would fall under the weight of his plagues, their populations twisted and transformed into grotesque abominations. Where once there had been life, there would now be only rot and ruin. With the Feochtar Grendel abomination by his side, Morbus marched forward, his mind consumed by the divine purpose that now drove him. The galaxy would tremble beneath the weight of Nurgle's blessings, and he would be the one to deliver them. The Rotwarden had been born.
So, what did you think? Did you like it? Did you dislike it? Tell me why. We're both bits. Not much to say. I enjoyed writing it. It's completed. I have the fourth part. I just need to edit all the icons and stuff. That's about it. More stuff coming on the way. Again, I got the Space Marine Tyranid Nurgle story, the Heist story, and then this crazy story. And we'll see where that goes. So please like, comment, subscribe, and I hope you guys enjoy it. If you didn't, tell me why. I need to know why. Okay, I really need to know. Alright, thank you.